literally had my life's priorities upside down. I grew up believing that if you were a good provider, you were by definition a good husband. Our marriage was just in a slow death spiral. It became clear that that the break was meant to be. I gave the Lord 6 months to show me what his plan was before I tried to figure it out myself.
Okay, God, you got 6 months.
You
Go.
got 6 months. I mean, that's a long time, right? If you're in the middle of a crisis, if you're in the middle of facing it, it's much more difficult to decide where your limits are, decide where your boundaries are. Our goal in life should be to...
Today on P-Cubed, we have the privilege of speaking with Paul Michalski, a distinguished leader whose journey from a high-profile legal career to founding Integrous offers profound insights for millennial leaders. Paul's story, featured in Eric Metaxas's Miracles, highlights his professional and personal transformation and commitment to integrating faith into professional life. As creator of the Integriosity framework, Paul guides organizations toward faithful integrity and biblical flourishing. His active involvement with the New Canaan Society further underscores his dedication to fostering authentic community among men. With degrees from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and a successful tenure as a partner at a prestigious law firm, Paul's transition from founding Integrous reflects a deep commitment to aligning professional endeavors and personal faith. For millennials seeking purpose-driven careers and authentic leadership, Paul's experiences offer valuable lessons in navigating the intersection of faith and work and personal growth. Oh, when I met you, I didn't know this, but I was excited to learn that one of the things about your life, one of the challenges that you had, is actually captured in Eric Metaxas's book, Miracles. And I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with Eric, but in that book, Miracles, it details a significant personal transformation that you underwent. Can you share with us the pivotal moments that led to this change and how it influenced your professional life?
Sure. Well, it was God hitting me over the head with a 2x4. And it really happened on October 5th of 2003. My wife and I were in church, and I reached out to take her hand. She pulled it away. That night, we put the kids to bed, and I said to her, something wrong. You pulled your hand away today at church. And her words were simply this: I don't know where to start. I'm not happy, and I can't go on like this. I just knew inside that this was much bigger than those words themselves. And I absolutely broke down. You see, I was clueless. I was completely clueless how unhappy she was, how lonely she was. In fact, 9 months earlier, she had made the conscious decision to emotionally withdraw from our marriage. And I had no idea. I was not present as a husband. I grew up believing that if you were a good provider, you were by definition a good husband and a good father. And I was doing really well in the provision category. If you had looked at our life at the time, you would have said, wow, it's a dream life. I had a great career. We had 2 beautiful kids, beautiful wife, wonderful house. And yet inside, our marriage was just in a slow death spiral that I was completely unaware of or just in complete denial of. And so it was in that moment that 3 things happened. First was I saw a film reel go by in my head. And it wasn't a film reel of the past. It was a film reel of the future and what I imagined our life to be with my kids and with her. And I had the sense it wasn't going to happen. The second thing was that I, in that moment, recognized that this was not something that I was going to be able to control or fix with the 3 tools that I controlled my world so efficiently, which was hard work, intelligence, and money. And the third thing was that in that moment, I did something I hadn't done in a very, very long time as I cried out to God to help me. Through a series of coincidences, a couple weeks later, I found myself in a house in New Canaan, Connecticut, at a group called the New Canaan Society. New Canaan Society was a group of marketplace men. It was a place for men to just come together, share life, be vulnerable, develop authentic friendships. Well, my faith up to that point had been a fairly shallow faith. It had been a very religious faith. And these men began to teach me about Jesus and about his promises and about who I was meant to be as a husband and as a father. And it was transformational for me. And it was in that moment I decided to take a leap of faith that God could actually restore our marriage, that God wanted to restore our marriage. My faith was incredibly simple at the time, right? It says in this book, Malachi, I hate divorce, saith the Lord. God promises that nothing is impossible with him. He would never leave me or forsake me. He loves me unconditionally, and he would never let me go through something that I couldn't handle. And so I just determined that I was going to pursue him and just do whatever it took to allow him to try to change me into the man that he wanted me to be. And that was then October 5th, 2003. December 5th of 2003, I gave my life to the Lord and accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And through a very, very challenging following year, things got much worse before they got better. It got to a place where men were saying, it's impossible. It's hopeless. Your wife has moved on in her life. You're in denial. You should just give up and get through this divorce and move on with your life. She had filed for divorce eventually in 2004. But every time I heard that, God would show up in ways that I understood to tell me, don't give up. Keep believing. Keep believing. And sometimes those were fairly dramatic, the way he showed up. In November of 2004, he turned her heart around in 24 hours, miraculously. And then she took a leap of faith. She took a leap of faith in believing that he actually could give us a healthy marriage. And so, in a sense, there were two bookends of faith. I took a leap of faith at the beginning of it that he could do it, and then it took her leap of faith at the end that he could do it. And so it was in November of 2004 that we were for the first time walking in faith together. And that changed everything about my life. I mean, most importantly, it changed my priorities in life. If you had asked me in 2003, what are your priorities in life? I would have said work, because if I'm a good provider, I'm a good husband and a good father. My children would come next, because wouldn't my wife want me to give whatever time is left to our kids? If there was anything left after that, which there rarely was, it would be her. And God was someplace, maybe down low on that priority list. And what I learned from this was I had literally had my life's priorities upside down. That God had to be first, that my wife deserved to be second. And in fact, for us to be healthy was the best thing we could do for our children. So our children were next, and then work was down below that. But that if God was first, he actually wants me to have a fulfilled life in all those other aspects. So that was the greatest personal change for me. Professionally, it really, now in hindsight, was actually a stage in what is, I often talk about as sort of 7 stages God has taken me in my career to where I am today. And that was stage 3 that I call, getting hit by a sledgehammer. The stages go back to when I was 8 years old. My professional journey began at 8 years old, really. At 8 years old, I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to go to Harvard College, and I knew I wanted to go to Harvard Law School at 8 years old. And that was somewhat unusual because I was the first in my family to go to college, and I didn't know any lawyers. But that was just somehow planted in me. Also, at 8 years old, I was confirmed in the Catholic Church. And I recall the line of us standing in the back of the church as the bishop was leaving. And he came back and he shook hands with everybody and he said, "Congratulations, congratulations, congratulations." And he looked me in the eye and he shook my hand at 8 years old and he said, "Congratulations, you're going to be a priest one day. Congratulations, congratulations." And I remember thinking, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a lawyer, and those have nothing to do with each other. And that began a 50-year journey to understand why they have everything to do with each other. And so, that first stage I call sort of shallow faith and dreams. I had these dreams. My faith was a very religious faith. I was an altar boy, but there was nothing deep about. I believed in God. Stage 2 was really living the dream. I actually did get into Harvard College. I did get into Harvard Law School. At 15 years old, I identified the law firm that I wanted to work at after I got out of Harvard Law School. I got a job at that law firm. I became a partner in that law firm. I was living the dream. My faith became relegated to Easter and Christmas. And so stage 3 was the sledgehammer. Having lived that dream, when God sort of woke me up to have my faith begin to go deeper. And at work, I was clueless in a new way, right? I was clueless in my marriage for a long time. And now I was all of a sudden clueless at work. But what I was clueless about was, okay, now I'm a Christian and I'm still a lawyer in this big law firm. What does that mean? And I had no idea what it meant. I didn't find anything out there to tell me what it meant. Nobody told me what it meant. So I just sort of stumbled through. I put a Bible up on my bookshelf. I tried to be nicer to people. I looked for opportunities to pray for people. But it was all about kind of how do I just be a better me in the workplace. And so at that stage, it really sort of it got me thinking about it, but I think it was also became the roots of what I'm doing now, because I experienced the frustrations that God has led me to now try to help people work through and fully understand what his purpose is for their work and for their business.
So good. So good. That's so many questions come to mind. I want to go back real quick to the this tipping point story and the cauldron that you went through on at the Rubicon. Tell me a little bit about Lisa's side. That's your wife. What's the side of her story? Because that's one of the ahas I got as I read through the chapter. And as you tell me about that, why would that story you shared with us, because I have to be frank with you, Paul, a lot of people go through a reconciliation, right, in their marriage. But what made it a miracle?
Well, to me, the miracle was that she truly had moved on, right? I mean, she really had moved on. And it was overnight that she had this overwhelming feeling one evening, November 2004. It was actually a Friday. It was a day that they had told us at the New Canaan Society that the founder was checking himself into rehab. Came home and shared that with her. We didn't really know him. We had met him a couple of times. And that day, she was, for the strangest reason, undone. She had a presentation to make in New York City, and she went in and she told me that she just wasn't herself, that this news about him somehow was affecting her. That night, she had dinner with friends. In the middle of dinner, she just said she had to leave. She got up and she ran out, got in her car, and started driving home, and was overwhelmed by this feeling that what she was doing was not who she was, and cried out to God to save her marriage, save her life. I almost had to pull over several times. The next morning, when she woke up, I didn't know any of this happened. Friends swooped in to try to convince her, don't give up. First she went to a spin class that morning on a Saturday morning. She did 2 back-to-back hour spin classes. And she said at the end of the second class, she was sitting on the bike, closed her eyes, and she saw Christ on the cross at Calvary, and realized for the first time that he had done it just for her. And that's when she really realized that what she was doing was not who he had made her to be. And that's when friends swooped in to try to convince her to be strong and to, she deserved to be happy and don't give up on this divorce and you got to move forward. But she just knew in that moment that she had to change course. And over the course of the next week began unwinding things. But there was one nagging thought, and this was where I saw that leap of faith. The one nagging thought with her was, I've tried everything. And there are really only 2 things I can see here. One is a lousy marriage, or getting out of it. I don't see a possible path through the middle, something that's good. The following weekend, our son, it was his birthday, and she said, we're going to do everything together today, whatever you want to do. And he said, well, I want to go see the movie Polar Express, which had just come out. So we went as a family to see Polar Express. And when the message believe came through in the movie, she knew that that was God speaking to her to tell her, you just have to believe that I can find that third path for you that you haven't been able to find yourself. Up to this point, again, I don't know anything has changed. As far as I know, the divorce is proceeding. The lawyers were talking. So that was on a Sunday. Monday, I came home from work, and she had her wedding ring on for the first time in 9 months. And I asked her, I was thrown by it. I said, you have your ring on. And she said, well, it's a sign of my commitment to our marriage and to God. And I didn't even know how to process it. And the next day I came home, and I came home late from work, and we had been in separate bedrooms for almost a year. And I came home to go into our bedroom, and there she was asleep in our bed. Yeah. And it was from that moment on. So it truly was just as, he hit me over the head and created a radical transformation in her. He changed her trajectory in just the course of days.
Yeah, I remember reading that in the chapter, that last part where you walk in the bedroom and you see her in there. That's where my heart broke when I read the story, but quite frank with you. It's because God working in both of your hearts toward that reconciliation, and such a neat thing. The two things I want to go down. One's a rabbit trail. I know people, Paul, that have been in a circumstance like yours, and they've got this outside counsel, kind of like Job did, right? If you're familiar with the biblical story on Job, got counselors coming around and saying, hey, you got it wrong. This, you're doing this, blah, blah, blah. And, probably in your circumstance, along with some of the friends I have heard, go ahead, get divorced. To your point, you should be free. You should enjoy life. How do you handle that? What advice would you give to people, millennials right now, speaking to our audience? What advice would you give to them if they're receiving that advice, if they're listening to this and they're thinking through potentially going down the path that we've discussed?
Well, I would first of all remind them, assuming they actually did have marriage vows, and they said, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, until death do us part, that they made a covenant, not a contract. I mean, I remember going to a marriage counselor at the very beginning of when we were heading down this path, and I said to the woman, so what do you think about divorce? And she said, well, marriage is a contract. And in a contract, when it isn't working out for one party, then they may just decide that it's time to break the contract because it's a two-way street. And I said, I won't go to this person anymore. Yeah, we walked out. And so I think it's to really recognize that you have made a covenant with God, and that you're meant to keep that covenant. But second, I mean, that's easy to say. I think the second is that there's often a lie told, which is the kids will be just fine. And I can't tell you the number of people that I know who were the products of divorce and who've seen their kids. Their kids are struggling. Mm-hmm. And I think there are plenty of studies that show that it has a tremendous impact on the children. Will they be okay? Sure. I mean, they'll be okay. Will they be as healthy as they would have been? I don't think so.
Yeah, certainly their well-being, right, is not as
well.
Right.
But then it's to recognize that God hates divorce and that he will do the impossible. And to really believe that. And it's not about changing your spouse, it's about changing you. And both of you growing closer to the Lord, in which case you'll grow closer to each other. I think one of the big mistakes that people make is they give up on the 1 yard line. There was a great story I heard about Chuck Yeager, who was the guy who broke the sound barrier. And apparently Chuck Yeager wasn't the first person to try to break the sound barrier. Here was the difference, that as you were getting closer and closer and closer to breaking the sound barrier, the plane would begin to shake and shake very violently, feel like it's going to just blow apart. And that the difference between Chuck Yeager and the other people who had tried was he didn't let off. They all got scared and they gave up. He pushed through. And when he broke the sound barrier, there was peace and quiet on the other side. And I think that we give up on the brink of God's success. And the world just will push us to do that because we want to avoid the pain. And people will tell us, you're going to be so much happier. And I can tell you again, there are so many people who, they got divorced and it's 5, 10, 15 years later. And the pain is continuing, the fights are continuing, the animosity is continuing. To really believe that God's promise and God's will and his ability to restore, and to be willing to just change, to change yourself and to look at yourself and take 100% responsibility for your own actions and your own responses.
So good. So good. And so don't give up, in other words, right?
Don't give up. Do not give up.
That's really good. Reminds me of the scene in Top Gun, right, with Maverick. Did you see that? Right, where he's doing the flight test, and it's the same kind of thing. I'm sure that the Chuck Yeager story inspired that scene, but he's pressing through, right, and doesn't think he's going to make it, and boom, goes through. And so to visually see that, if you watch that movie, you'll get what Paul is talking about on it. Thank you for sharing that story. So true. Hey, so let's go back to your career now. So you're at the law firm. I remember you said you're trying to be a better version of yourself in that.
Yep.
Tell me, why did you leave? And then when you get there, tell me why you left and then what you're doing now.
Yep. And I left about 5 years later after all this happened. So for 5 years, I was continuing to practice, continuing to do what I was doing, continuing to try to be a better person in the way that I was doing things. And there were a few times that people kind of acknowledged there was something different. A few times that conversations happened. Only one person in those 5 years ever noticed the Bible sitting on my bookshelf, by the way. And he was an IT guy who said, and he was a Christian. He said, sheepishly said to me, Are you a Christian?
Nice. Yes.
But it just over time, what became clear, and it's hard to describe. I think a friend of mine has this phrase, you just know when you're knower. And it began to become clear to Lisa and I that God was calling me out to something else, both in how I was recognizing a change in my passion for what I was doing, that I didn't look forward to Mondays as much as I looked forward to Mondays. There was something changing. It was like he was removing some of that passion that I had that kept me at 2:00 in the morning, still just like, this is the only place I want to be. And also just changes in kind of the whole culture a bit, that just as it all came together, we really sensed that he was saying, I have a different plan for your life. And we both had to be in agreement on that because it was a huge step. But I look back and I sometimes call it my Abrahamic moment, because it was, I want you to walk away from this for a different plan that I have for you, but I'm not telling you what that plan is. And so initially I took a 6-month leave of absence and got really involved with the New Canaan Society at the time when it was starting to transition from the home of the founder to just one chapter to really beginning to grow nationally. But it became clear that that the break was meant to be a permanent break from the firm, and so walked away. And I thought very generously gave the Lord 6 months to show me what his plan was before I tried to figure it out myself.
Okay, God, you got 6 months.
You
Go.
got 6 months. I mean, that's a long time, right?
That's right. Why not?
At almost precisely 6 months, Lisa and I were sharing our marriage testimony at a marriage retreat. And I was standing in front of the room saying, unconditional love is what it says it is. It's unconditional. So you can't say, God, I'll give you 6 months to fix my spouse or I'm out. And I heard a voice inside say, that doesn't only apply to your marriage. And I knew in that moment that my 6-month deadline was a joke. And so it really became a daily waking up and saying, Lord, you've given me another day. I'm yours. What is it we're meant to be doing today? And it took 10 years before it became clear what I was meant to do. But in that 10 years, God was building the tools for what it was. He was building the tools through, as the main avenue, through the New Canaan Society. I became very involved, volunteering my time, much of my time with the founder, as the organization began to grow. And it is a marketplace ministry, so I became very involved in the faith and work movement and in marketplace ministry. And I also ran away from a prophecy for several years. Back in 2008, before I even left the firm, an old New Canaan Society member called me up on Martin Luther King Day, and he said, can I come over? God has been downloading to me about you for 3 days. I've been writing it all down. And he shows up at my door and tells me this. And so what am I going to say? No, we don't come back tomorrow. So he comes in, and the gist of it was, you're meant to start a Christian law firm where greed is not the creed, serving clients for whom greed is not the creed. I listened respectfully. I tucked it away, told Lisa about it, nobody else. But I was still practicing in the firm where I was practicing, so it didn't really resonate. So now roll forward 4 years, 2012. Now I've been out of the firm for a couple of years, and he calls me back and he says, did you ever do anything with that prophecy I gave you? I said, well, to be honest, no, I haven't. He said, well, I have a few more things that the Lord's given me. Can I share them? I said, sure. So he shared them. And at this time, I thought, I have some time. So I went off. We have a home in Vermont. I went up to Vermont for a few days, and I said, I'm just going to be in silence and pray about what he's given me. And as I prayed, I really sensed God say, yes, you're meant to do this, and you're meant to do it with two people like, and he gave me 2 names of solo practitioners that I knew. I dutifully wrote it down, told nobody but Lisa, and went about my business and didn't do anything about it again. Roll forward 2 more years, 2014, and one of the 2 people whose names I'd written down called Lisa, and he said that he and the other person whose name I had secretly written down were thinking of starting a Christian law firm, and did she think that I would have any interest in joining their conversation? So, 3 times I finally get it. Right? God was yelling in the megaphone. So we sat down and we started to work out what would this look like. And within the course of a year, the Lord removed both of them. And I was there now sitting on my own with this thing in front of me, with the name Integrous, and a little tale that I had added to our website. I didn't know why. It was meant to be just a normal law firm doing corporate business work, but doing it with a Christian lens on. And I had said, I want to put something about integrity advising on here. I don't know why, but I think I want to have a placeholder for it. I don't even know what it is, but I want to have this placeholder. And they said, okay, yeah. So we had that in there. And when they left, and I sat back and said, all right, I need to just take some time, God. You took me down this path, then you removed the 2 people who got me to the table. What do you want me to do? And in the course of it, one morning, Lisa came in and she saw I was kind of just, a bit distressed. And I said, the stuff I was doing before, it's just not energizing me. And she said, well, what would make you wholehearted? I said, this integrity advising thing that I'm not quite sure what it is, but that's what it is. She said, well, maybe you ought to figure out what that is. And that began the journey. And interestingly, I look back in my journal, and a few years earlier, like 3 years earlier, I had written in my journal, maybe integrity advising is what I should be doing. I don't even remember it. And that really began the formation of Integrous. And Integrous is an advisory firm that provides integrity advice and legal counsel to leaders, the faithful leaders, to help them live with faithful integrity, to understand how they integrate their business into their faith so that they can live an integrated life, that they can live a life in which they are aligned, that what they're doing through their business, what they're doing through their work is aligned with the beliefs and the principles and the priorities of their Christian faith.
So good. So good. Tell me about the framework that you have with your organization.
Sure. Well, part of what in those course of a few years as I sort of felt like God was downloading all of this content and model to me, I got the word Integriosity was the word that sort of came up. And it's a combination of integrity and generosity. And what sort of came out of it was a 4-step process in alignment. And the 4 steps are renew, reimagine, realign, and restore. So the first step, renew, is to really sit down with that business leader and renew their mind as to God's real purpose for work and business. Because the church has not really done a great job of helping us understand the role of business and the role of work and how God views that. And so a lot of business leaders who have a deep faith actually don't have a very good understanding of what their faith has to do with their business and with their work. So true. And so the first is to go through this renewal stage and begin to take people through some critical mind shifts that I think have to happen for them to really understand the intersection of faith and work. To point out to them some of the, what I call faith as usual side roads that they can get detoured on, that so many, as I saw in the faith and work movement, so many people get detoured on these side roads, and none of them are bad, but I don't believe they're God's best. And yet they're side roads that people get acclaim for, they get put up on stage to talk about their faith and work integration. And again, they're not bad, but I think God has called them to much more. So the renewal stage is really, let's really understand what God's purpose for work and business are. And then with that renewed understanding, now let's sit back and begin to reimagine. Well, what does that mean? If that's right, what does that mean for my business? What does that mean for what I'm doing? What does it mean for the way I hire people, for the way I terminate people, for the products that I'm making, for the way that I advertise, for the way that I treat my customers, for the benefits that I'm providing to my employees, everything about the business. Just sit back and imagine it. The third stage is the realign stage. So once you've kind of reimagined what that might look like, it's then the slow process of step by step, beginning to realign the purpose and the values and the culture of the organization to fit that reimagined vision in a way that reinforces your faith and really embraces your faith, until ultimately people do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons without even thinking. And the restore stage is really the culmination, which is once that culture is realigned, you begin to restore the brokenness of the world, the brokenness of work, the brokenness of relationships in the workplace. And so that's the fruit that comes from the realignment.
That's awesome. Do you have an example of an organization that went through that transformational process? Don't need names, company name, or anything like that, but tell us about an example where somebody came to you and said, okay, here's where we are, and you worked them through that.
It's the renew stage is the realignment stage is a long process. Mm-hmm. And it really is at the renew stage. What's really unfortunate, if you think about this, you think of 4 gaps that a business leader has to get across. I call them the Sunday Monday gap, the sacred secular gap, the knowing doing gap, and a safety surrender gap. Sunday Monday gap is simply recognizing that my faith has something to do with my life outside of Sundays. That, okay, there's something my faith has to do with my work. A lot of Christians have crossed that. A lot of Christians are across that gap, and they understand that, all right, somehow my work is, my faith has to inform my. But the next gap is the much more difficult one, and that's the sacred secular gap. And that is actually understanding that my work and my business are sacred. They are actually a sacred platform. They are not merely a place to do sacred things. They are sacred in and of themselves. Doing excellent work glorifies God. Loving people in the workplace glorifies God. Business itself has intrinsic kingdom value. It doesn't only have value as a platform to evangelize people or as a platform to make money that you can give to charities or give to missionaries. That recognition that business itself is a sacred venture is something that I think the church, unfortunately, has not taught people in a way that really trying to keep that sacred-secular divide to, in some sense, I think, elevate the priesthood, elevate the clergy, and create this divide, right? There are some faith and work ministries who've done surveys of their members, and the estimates are that at most 10% and probably sort of less than 10% of self-proclaimed evangelical Christians have actually crossed the sacred secular.
Yeah. Say that one more time.
That at most 10% of self-proclaimed evangelical Christians actually have that understanding of their work. And you need that understanding to even begin down this path. And I think that gap is one of the things that has held back the faith and work movement from having a greater transformation, greater impact.
Right.
You know, the knowing doing gap is, okay, if I get to that, now I know it in my head. What does that actually mean? How do I do it? Right. And that's kind of the process of actually the realignment and beginning through this 4 stages. The 4th gap, I said that the sacred secular gap was a harder one. The 4th gap is the hardest of all, and that's what I'm calling the safety surrender gap. That's when I really recognize the complete stewardship of my business, that God really is the owner. People throw this around all the time. I'm a steward of my business and God owns it. But to truly surrender it and surrender how you run that business to God's purposes and God's priorities and God's principles, first of all, I think requires personal surrender, right? A leader can't take a business farther than they've gone themselves personally.
That's right.
So how many Christians have actually surrendered their lives in a fully dependent way? George Barna, back in 2011, wrote a book called Maximum Faith. And Barna said that based on his years of research, about 2% of Christians have crossed into surrender. So you got 10% who don't even only 10% who even understand that their business is sacred. Only 2% actually come to a place of surrender where they are recognizing that God owns my business. And I think that it's critical to truly change the heart of the organization. So one of the mind shifts, and probably the most difficult mind shift as part of that renewed stage of Integriosity, is to recognize that if profit is the end of the business, end toward which you manage your business, people, by definition, can never be more than tools of production to be manipulated and managed toward that end, because Scripture tells us we can't serve 2 masters. So we get one true end, one true priority that we are going to manage the business for. And if profit remains, the maximization of profit remains that, and people are just a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And to surrender your business to God, to really see God as an owner, means you have to recognize that the business has to be managed to an end that God values. And what God values is His creation. He values people. So I think you have to actually shift your mind to say, the end toward which I'm going to manage my business is to maximize the flourishing of all the creation I touch. Profit is absolutely necessary. It is absolutely critical. I mean, it is critical for the sustainability of the organization. It is critical to honor the flourishing of the owners of the organization. But if you switch it to be a means to the end of flourishing rather than the end itself, all of a sudden now what my mindset is my job is to optimize profit to bring the greatest flourishing because the greatest flourishing glorifies God in the greatest way. And to think of it, a business is simply an association of people who come together with a common objective to achieve something they couldn't achieve by themselves. Well, if the only purpose, the ultimate purpose for which every human being was created in the image of God is to glorify God, it has to be that the purpose of an association of people coming together to do something can't change that ultimate purpose. And that the purpose of that business has to be to glorify God. And I think you glorify God in three ways. I would say you glorify God by humanizing people, beautifying the world, and then that glorifies God. So I think it's so hard to get someone to even come to that renew stage and that renew step of the process.
Yeah, really, really hard steps, and it's only done. There's a cost to it, right? For people.
Well, and there is a cost, and it's part of recognizing that, part of living that surrender is to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost, to actually to actually sacrifice your will for God's will, no matter the cost.
Yeah, and so that leads, this is probably the last question before I move you into the lightning round, Paul, as we wrap this up.
Yeah.
So between what we discussed about your marriage, the reconciliation, your career transformation and change, and now you're leaning in with other people and organizations that go on that transformational journey. What advice would you have for the millennials that are listening today? What would you tell them based on your experience, where you've been? What would your takeaway for them be?
I would tell them three things. They should never try to integrate their faith into their professional lives there's a great quote from Max Dupree, who was the chairman of Herman Miller Furniture. And he once said, talking about integrating your faith into your work is like talking about integrating your marriage into your sex life. It's absolutely backwards. If your work is big enough to hold your faith is very small. So first of all, begin to think about, how do I integrate my work and my business into my faith? My faith is my life. Because what will happen is, I think when people talk about integrating their faith into their work, what often happens is you try to think about, all right, what Christian pixie dust can I sprinkle over my business or over my work to make it look Christian?
Yeah, sure.
As opposed to, how do I actually begin to do my work in a way that is fully integrated into who I am as a follower of Christ? Right. The second I would say to them is, don't ever try to be a Christian business person or a Christian lawyer or whatever it might be that you do. The reason is, think about that. And people say that all the time. I want to be a Christian. You should be a Christian business person. No, you shouldn't. Because if a Christian business person, think about it, the noun is business person. The adjective is Christian. I'm a business person trying to do it in a Christian way. We get one primary identity. Can't serve two masters. I have to decide my primary identity. I believe that I will sacrifice my secondary identity to ensure my success in my primary identity. If I am a Christian business person, I am first and foremost a business person. And I will sacrifice the doing it in a Christian way. I will water down doing it in a Christian way to ensure my success in my primary identity. If, however, I begin to put on the mirror that I look at every morning when I brush my teeth, I am a follower of Christ engaged in business, I begin to have my whole mind I think about what I'm doing differently. And when I face that dilemma in the workplace, when I face that challenge where I'm being asked to do something that just doesn't feel right and it offends who I am as a follower of Christ, I have the courage to say, that's the identity that I'm going to protect. Because even if it means I lose my job, because I'm trusting that God will take care of me. I'm fully dependent on him.
Sure.
The third piece of advice I would say to them is, do not ever try to seek work-life balance.
Amen.
That work-life balance is I think, a deception straight from the pit of hell.
Okay.
The
Why?
reason is because it sets up work as an oppositional force to life.
Mm-hmm.
It means that the way I get more life is by reducing work. But God's design, if we go back to Genesis, God's design is that work is actually part of us being fully human. It is part of Imago Dei, is part of how we were created in the image of God. Work was a good thing that we were given to do because it reflected the Creator in whose image we were made. That we actually need to work in order to become fully human. We become fully human when we act in alignment with our divine design. And so the idea that we should try to reduce work and that we should, our goal in life should be to move to Naples and just play golf every day, I think is completely out of line with what God has made us to be. We need a broader definition of work. The problem is we define work as something for which someone gives me a paycheck. Whereas work is, I think, anything where I am using my God-given productivity and creativity to serve and love other people. Maybe I get a paycheck, maybe I don't get a paycheck, but that's kind of in God's category. So don't seek work-life balance, seek life balance. You absolutely need life balance. And in that, life is work, and there's family and all those things, and you need to have a balance, because I'm the first one to tell you that when work became the predominant part of who I was, it absolutely destroyed and almost destroyed family. And I had to reorder that priority.
Yeah, I always tell people that priorities need to be God, family, and then your work. And if you get those out of order in any way, things normally get messed up.
No, absolutely. Yeah. But I think that, and then in that, again, that in family, it's often easy to put children ahead of spouse. But I think that spouse needs to be your first priority.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that. What a blessing today. Paul, you and I've talked about this, but I'm waiting on your book. I know you're doing a bunch of blogs, but as soon as you get that thing out, I've learned more, and hopefully our listeners today have as well. I've got 5 quick questions for you. They're lightning round. Don't have to expand on them. We'll just give like a one-word answer, whatever it is, and we'll roll on it. So that'll be good. So here we go. Here's the first question. What's the most impactful book that you've ever read?
The Bible would be an easy choice, but I'll go outside of that. The book that the book I probably most recommend to people is To Change the World by James Hunter.
Awesome. Okay, good. If you could witness any event from the Bible, which would it be and why?
I think it would be the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
So that I could ask Jesus to kind of explain all those things.
So what do you mean by that? So very good. Well, how about one habit that keeps you grounded?
Getting up early, and the first thing I do is I read 2 or 3 different devotionals and read scripture in the morning before doing anything else, because that's how God speaks to me. God often speaks to me through the things I read, the devotionals I read, and something will jump out at me, and I will immediately share it over I keep my journal in OneNote, and I will send it over for the day and keep those, and I can go back and search through them and see those little nuggets that have come out. And sometimes it'll be, the same message will come out in 2 or 3 things on the same day, and I'll know, all right, I got to pay attention.
Sure. It's so important to be intentional about that, right? As it sets the tone for the day and for everything else that we do, certainly. Question number 4, if you had to summarize your leadership philosophy in 3 words, we've got 3 words only, what would they be? 3 words.
Gosh, then, does the count as a word?
It can. Sure. Want to get technical?
Does it have to count as a word?
No, it doesn't have to. Yeah, that's right. Right. I won't penalize you if it is 4.
The next right thing.
Next right.
Do the next right thing.
Like it. Okay, good. And what's one piece of advice you'd give to young leaders just starting out?
Set the lines of integrity that you don't want to cross ahead of time. Because if you're in the middle of a crisis, if you're in the middle of facing it, it's much more difficult to decide where your limits are, decide where your boundaries are, decide what your principles are, than if you've sat down and thoughtfully thought about the lines you won't cross.
That's awesome. Man, Paul, you have been an awesome guest and interview today. I know that the people that are listening, that are tuning in, will gain huge benefits, not only from your transparency early on as we started the podcast and talking about your marriage and the miracle that happened in that, but then also how you moved from being in the law firm into your practice now that you have, right? And the way you're doing that. And then, man, I love these thoughts on faith in the workplace. Those last three things that you gave us really flip things on their head and make us think differently about that. And that's what we need, right? We don't want to keep going through these cliches, but we have to ask questions, or why are we doing these things? One thought that came to mind as you write another blog is that you said the pronoun and the adjective, the Christian business person.
Yep.
Could write an article that's titled, the hook might be, it says, what is your noun? Not pronoun, right? But what's your noun? What's your noun?
I wrote it. And
there you go.
It exists.
See, there you go. That's good. Hence, you need a book, right? So this is all good stuff. So I'm not that original. So good stuff. See, you're a thinker. You're the guy that went to Harvard. I just, it's the guy on the other side of the mic here. All right. Hey, well, thank you so much. This was awesome today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Preston. God bless you.
All right. Hey, thanks for joining P Cubed. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And were you inspired by today's conversation? Please share it with a friend or a colleague. And for more insights, visit the show notes to connect with Paul Michalski. For more insights, visit the show notes and connect with Paul Michalski and learn about Integriosity or join the New Canaan Society. And don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram for updates and inspiration. Thanks for tuning in. Take care and talk soon.